The chamber lights flickered red before anyone spoke a single word. I felt it before I understood it, that strange pressure in the air when a room decides something terrible is about to happen. I was standing behind Ambassador Grace Whitfield, close enough to see her knuckles whiten around the edge of the podium, close enough to hear her breath catch and then steady. Speaker Orvin Keth of the Sesleyan Assembly had just finished reading the ruling aloud, and the silence that followed felt like a blade hanging in the air. "The proposal for full human representation," Orvain said, his voice smooth and slow, the way it always was when he wanted to sound gentle while delivering something cruel, "is denied. Again. The Council thanks the human delegation for its patience." Patience. That word landed on me like a slap, and I was only a junior liaison officer standing in the back row. I could not imagine what it did to Grace, who had spent 11 years building alliances, translating human intentions into 100 different languages and cultures, smoothing over every insult with a diplomat's smile. I watched her shoulders rise and fall, once, twice, and then she did something I had never seen her do in all my years serving beside her. She turned off her translator earpiece, slowly, deliberately. She set it down on the podium in front of her, the little device clicking against the metal surface, and the sound seemed to echo through the entire chamber, even though it was barely louder than a whisper. "Ambassador," Orvain said, his tone shifting, uncertain now. "Is there a technical difficulty?" "No," Grace said, and for the first time in 11 years, she did not smile. "There is no difficulty? I understand you perfectly." I remember scanning the chamber in that moment, the way the seats rose in tiers around us, delegates from 43 worlds looking down at the human section like spectators at a trial. The Vantoran counselor beside Orvani leaned forward, antennae twitching with what I now recognize as genuine confusion. They had never seen a human ambassador stop smiling before. None of them had. "We have sat in this chamber for 62 years, Grace said, and her voice did not rise, did not shake. It simply carried, filling every corner of that vast room, without any amplification at all. "We have submitted 11 proposals for full council membership. We have provided disaster relief to 14 member worlds without asking for a single vote in return. We have kept your trade corridors clear of raiders for 3 decades. We have calibrated navigation systems for species who would not shake our hands in public." Orvane opened his mouth to respond, but Grace was not finished, and something in her tone made even the automated translation systems along the walls fall silent, as if they too understood this was not a moment for interruption. "And you call us juvenile," she said. "You call us unpredictable. You call us dangerous and reckless and too young to sit among you as equals. 62 years, and the answer is still no." I remember the exact temperature of that room. I remember how cold it felt despite the environmental controls holding steady at a comfortable 22 degrees. I remember the way my own heart was pounding against my ribs, not from fear exactly, but from the sudden certainty that I was witnessing something the history archives would replay for centuries. "Ambassador Whitfield," Orvain said, and now there was an edge in his voice, something close to alarm. "I would remind you that intemperate words in this chamber carry consequences." "I am not being intemperate," Grace said. "I am being honest, which is apparently a rarer commodity in this room." She gathered the small stack of data tablets in front of her, the physical props she had always insisted on using, even though every piece of information could have been transmitted instantly. I understood only later that she had wanted this moment to be slow, to be deliberate, to be something every delegate in that chamber would remember with their own eyes, rather than through a recording. "We came to this council in good faith," she said. "We believed that time and patience would earn us a seat at your table. We were wrong, so we are leaving your table." The chamber erupted into overlapping voices, translators struggling to keep pace with the sudden flood of alarmed chatter from a dozen different species at once. I heard the sharp clicking speech of the Corveth delegation, the low rumbling tones of the Ilix representative, all of it blending into a wall of sound that Grace simply walked through, unhurried, her back straight, her human security detail falling into step behind her without needing to be told. I followed her out of that chamber with my pulse hammering in my ears, and I remember thinking, foolishly, that surely someone would stop us. Surely someone would call after her, offer some last concession, some final compromise to keep humanity in that room. No one did. The doors sealed behind us with a soft hydraulic hiss, and just like that, 62 years of careful diplomacy ended in under 4 minutes. Outside, in the transit corridor that connected the council chamber to the docking spires, Grace stopped walking. She stood very still for a long moment, staring at nothing, and I realized her hands were trembling now that no one could see them do it. "Ambassador," I said quietly, "are you certain about this?" She looked at me, and there was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction at having delivered a historic speech. There was only a tired, quiet grief. "I have spent 11 years trying to convince them we belong here," she said. "I am tired of convincing people who have already decided the answer. Let them see what silence looks like." I did not fully understand what she meant until much later, until the silence she spoke of stopped being a metaphor and became something the entire galaxy could feel. We reached the docking spire within the hour, and I watched from the observation deck as the human transport vessel Meridian's Grace, named for no one in particular though the delegates always assumed otherwise, disengaged from its berth. Around us, other ships continued their business as though nothing unusual had happened. Alien freighters and passenger liners drifting past our departure with the same indifference they always showed us. I remember Captain Daniel Marsh standing beside me on that deck, arms crossed, watching the same scene. "They don't even notice," he said, "do they?" "Not yet," I said. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "They will." I did not know then how right he was. I only knew that something fundamental had shifted, that the quiet, patient version of humanity that had sat in that chamber for 6 decades had finally run out of patience, and that whatever came next would not be quiet at all. Within 72 hours, every human vessel operating under Council jurisdiction received the same directive: return to home space, cease all cooperative operations, withdraw from every joint task force, every relief mission, every border patrol that had, for years, quietly kept the edges of civilized space from fraying apart. I remember reading that directive twice, certain I had misunderstood it. We were not simply leaving the chamber. We were leaving everything. Admiral Laura Bennett addressed the fleet 3 days later, her image broadcast to every human vessel still scattered across Council space, waiting for instructions on how to come home. "For 62 years, she said, "we have carried weight that was never acknowledged and never respected. We have held the line in places our so-called allies would not go. We have done this quietly, patiently, and it has earned us nothing but condescension." She paused, and even through the recording, I could feel the exhaustion behind her words, the same exhaustion I had seen in Grace's trembling hands. "That ends today," she said. "We are not declaring war. We are not making threats. We are simply going home, and we are going to let the galaxy manage its own affairs for a while. Perhaps then, they will understand what our patience was actually worth." I sat in the observation lounge of the Meridian's Grace as that broadcast played, surrounded by crew members who had spent years building relationships with alien counterparts, some of them close friends, and I watched the same complicated mixture of relief and dread cross every face in that room. Because we all understood something the Council delegates did not yet grasp. Humanity had never been the guest at that table. We had been the foundation holding half of it up, and foundations do not announce themselves. They simply exist, unnoticed, until the moment they are removed. I remember looking out the viewport as we made our final approach toward the border transit gate that would take us out of Council space and back toward Sol System, back toward home. Behind us, the Council chamber station grew smaller and smaller until it was just another point of light, among thousands, indistinguishable from any other. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel vindicated. I felt, more than anything, a strange and heavy uncertainty, the kind that comes when you know a door has closed behind you and you cannot yet see what lies ahead through the one that has opened. Captain Marsh found me there, staring out at the stars, and he said something I have never forgotten. "Everyone thinks a wall falling down is loud," he said. "It never is. It's quiet, right up until the moment the whole building comes down with it." I did not understand the full weight of those words until weeks later, when the first reports began arriving from the border worlds. worlds we had once quietly protected without a single one of their citizens ever knowing our names. The gate opened ahead of us, a shimmering ring of controlled energy against the black, and as our ship passed through it, I watched the council space fall away behind us, growing distant and small, a place we had called home for 62 years and would now watch from a very great distance. None of us aboard that ship could have known, not truly, what silence was about to cost the galaxy we had left behind. We only knew that we were finally, after 6 decades, allowed to stop pretending that our patience had ever been mistaken for weakness. The gate closed behind us with a soft, final pulse of light, and for the first time since I had joined the diplomatic corps, I felt something I had not expected to feel at all. I felt free, and I felt afraid, and I could not yet tell which feeling would prove to be the truer one. The first message came through as a minor shipping delay report, the kind of routine notice that usually meant nothing at all. I was 3 weeks into our return to Sol space when Lieutenant Oliver Hastings brought it to my attention, a flagged anomaly in the logistics feed we still monitored out of habit, an old reflex none of us had quite managed to shake yet. A supply convoy missed its window at the Threll relay, he said, sliding the report across the table toward me. 2 days late, no distress signal. Pirates? I asked. No idea, he said. The Threll relay used to run through our monitoring grid. We handed that off 6 days ago. I remember staring at that report for a long moment, feeling something cold settle in my stomach. The Threll relay was a minor waypoint, nothing strategic, nothing anyone would fight over. But it had always been quiet, predictable, safe, because for over a decade a human patrol rotation had kept it that way without ever being asked to. Log it and move on, I said, though something in me did not want to let it go. Within a week, similar reports began arriving faster than we could track them. A passenger liner near the Ilix trade lanes reported engine trouble and received no response from the nearest relief station, a station that had, until recently, always answered within minutes because a human vessel had been stationed close enough to respond. A mining convoy near the outer Vantoran colonies vanished from tracking entirely for 11 hours before reappearing, badly damaged, its crew reporting an attack that no one could explain because the security patrol that once covered that route had been quietly folded into our withdrawal. I began keeping a private log of these incidents, not because anyone asked me to, but because I could not stop myself from noticing the pattern forming beneath the surface of ordinary galactic traffic. Captain Marsh found me hunched over my console late one evening, the ship's corridor lights dimmed to their nighttime setting, and he leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed in that way he always did when he already suspected what I was about to tell him. How many now? He asked. 41 incidents in 19 days, I said, all in systems we used to patrol, all minor on their own, all getting worse. He exhaled slowly and sat down across from me, the council still calling it coincidence? Officially, yes, I said. Speaker Orvan gave a statement 3 days ago, called it a temporary adjustment period, said galactic infrastructure is resilient and will stabilize on its own. Marsh gave a short laugh with no humor in it at all. Resilient, he repeated. That's a nice word for pretending you didn't know who was holding the roof up. I thought about Grace often during those weeks, wondering what she felt watching these reports filter in from her new post, advising the Council Relations Office back on Earth. I finally reached her through a secure channel one evening, her face tired but composed on my screen, the same steady calm she had carried out of that chamber weeks earlier. You've seen the reports, I said. I have, she said. Every single one. Does it feel the way you thought it would? She was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully, the way she always did. I did not walk away from that chamber wanting anyone to suffer, she said. I walked away because I was tired of being asked to suffer quietly on everyone else's behalf. But knowing the difference does not make this easier to watch. I understood what she meant, because I felt the same tension pulling at me every single day. Part of me wanted to feel nothing but vindication, proof that the Council had finally learned what our absence cost them. But another part of me, the part that had spent years working alongside Vantoran engineers and Ilix traders and Ceslian scholars, could not separate the abstract idea of consequences from the very real people now living inside them. What does the Council actually know? I asked her. Less than they should, Grace said. They are still treating this as scattered bad luck. Speaker Orvain does not want to admit that humanity was doing anything essential, because admitting that means admitting the council failed to recognize it for 62 years. Pride is a powerful blindfold. 2 weeks later, the incidents stopped being minor. I remember the exact moment the report came through, because I was standing in the mess hall with a cup of coffee halfway to my mouth when the ship-wide alert chimed, and every screen in the room switched automatically to the emergency broadcast feed. A relay station near the border of Vantoran space, a station that monitored an entire cluster of nearby settlements, had gone completely dark. Not damaged, not delayed, simply silent, no signal at all, as though it had ceased to exist. "That's not a supply issue," Marsh said quietly, standing beside me, his own coffee forgotten on the table. "That's a full station." I felt my pulse quicken as the broadcast continued. Alien news correspondents speaking in rapid, anxious tones. Translators struggling to keep pace with the flood of speculation. Some said pirates, some said equipment failure, a few, quietly, in tones that suggested they did not fully believe their own words, mentioned rumors of something else, something the council had supposedly handled decades ago, something none of them wanted to name directly. I did not think much of that rumor at the time. None of us did. We were too focused on the immediate chaos, the sudden absence of a station that had, for years, relied on a human-monitored early warning system to catch problems before they became disasters. 3 days after the station went dark, a rescue convoy sent to investigate reported finding the station intact, but completely powerless, every system offline, every crew member accounted for and unharmed but deeply shaken, unable to explain what had happened, beyond a vague description of instruments failing all at once, and strange readings on their sensors in the final moments before the blackout. I remember thinking, at the time, that this still felt explainable. Equipment failure, perhaps. An unknown technical fault, exposed only because the safety net that would have normally caught it early had been withdrawn. I did not yet understand that we were looking at symptoms, not causes, and that the true cause had been dormant for a very long time, waiting patiently for exactly this kind of opportunity. Back on Earth, Grace found herself increasingly pulled into private briefings, informal conversations with council representatives, who no longer wanted to be seen publicly reaching out to humanity, but who were, in private, growing quietly desperate. She told me about one particular conversation with a Vantoran counselor named Thessaly Vorn, a woman Grace had known for over a decade, someone who had never once voted in favor of human council membership, but who had always treated Grace with a kind of distant, professional respect. She asked me directly, Grace said during our next call, whether humanity intended to let this continue indefinitely. I told her that was not really the right question. "What is the right question?" I asked. "Whether the council intends to admit what it lost," Grace said. "Because until they do that, nothing I say will matter. They still think this is about hurt feelings. They do not yet understand. It was never about feelings at all. It was about function. We were not just present in that chamber. We were load-bearing." I thought about that phrase often in the weeks that followed. Load-bearing. It captured something I had not quite been able to articulate myself. The quiet, unglamorous work humanity had done for decades, invisible until the moment it stopped. More reports followed, each one slightly stranger than the last. A trading outpost near the Corveth border reported an entire cargo fleet disappearing from sensors without any wreckage, any debris, any trace at all. A research station, studying an old, sealed anomaly field, reported a containment breach that the council quickly and quietly classified, refusing to release details, even to allied species. I began to notice something else too, a subtle shift in tone among the alien crews we still occasionally communicated with on shared frequencies, back when routine cooperation still connected our systems in small, technical ways. Where once there had been a familiar mixture of politeness and condescension in these exchanges, now there was something closer to genuine unease. I remember a brief exchange with a Vantoran communications officer named Yeslin Dor, someone I had spoken with regularly over the years during joint monitoring shifts. Before the withdrawal ended our cooperation entirely, she reached out unofficially, on a channel technically no longer authorized for use, her voice tight and careful. "Is it true?" she asked. that your patrols used to run automated deterrence sweeps through the outer relay corridors. Not just traffic monitoring, actual deterrence. I'm not authorized to discuss operational details, I said carefully, though the question itself told me something important. They were beginning to ask the right questions, even if they did not yet understand the full answer. Something is testing the edges of our space, she said quietly. Something that has not tested those edges in a very long time. I do not think it is coincidence that it started testing again the same month your ship stopped patrolling. I did not sleep well that night, turning her words over in my mind, trying to decide whether she was simply anxious or whether she had noticed something the rest of the council had not yet allowed itself to see. I brought the conversation to Captain Marsh the next morning, expecting him to dismiss it the way official channels had dismissed every other unsettling report. Instead, he listened quietly, his expression darkening with each detail, and when I finished, he was silent for a long moment. You know what's strange, he finally said, is that in 62 years, none of them ever asked us what we were actually doing out there. They just assumed we were being paid, or currying favor, or angling for influence. It never occurred to them that we might have been the reason certain things stayed quiet. You think this is connected to something specific, I said, not just general instability. He met my eyes, and I saw something in his expression I had not seen before, a kind of grim certainty that unsettled me more than any official report had managed to. I think, he said slowly, that we were never just filling gaps in their infrastructure. I think we were holding a door shut, and I think we just let go of the handle. I did not know then how literally true his words would prove to be, or how soon the galaxy would discover exactly what had been waiting quietly on the other side of that door. I returned to Earth for the first time in nearly a year during the 5th month after the withdrawal, summoned for a closed briefing that Admiral Bennett insisted required my presence in person rather than over any secure channel, no matter how encrypted. The briefing room at Fleet Command overlooked the Atlantic coastline, and I remember standing at the window for a moment before the session began, watching the ordinary rhythm of ships moving along the coast, so different from the vast, silent distances of border space I had grown used to. Grace was already seated at the long table when I arrived, along with several unfamiliar faces I did not recognize, engineers and analysts whose expressions all carried the same tightly controlled tension. "Ethan," she said, gesturing for me to sit beside her, "thank you for coming." "You made it sound urgent," I said. "It is," she said quietly. Admiral Bennett began the briefing without preamble, pulling up a series of charts and reports that traced humanity's quiet involvement across Council space over the past 3 decades, information I had known in fragments, but never seen compiled together in one place. "For 31 years, she said, our forces have maintained an unofficial network of deterrence patrols, disaster response teams, and infrastructure support across 43 member systems. None of this was ever formally acknowledged by the Council, because acknowledging it would have required granting us the standing we asked for, and were denied." She pulled up a new chart, this one showing a steady, unbroken line representing something labeled only as containment monitoring, stretching back further than I expected, decades before I had even joined the diplomatic corps. "What most of you do not know," she continued, because this information was classified even within our own command structure, is that a portion of our deterrence effort was specifically directed at a single, dormant threat the Council itself asked us to help monitor 40 years ago, under an agreement that was never made public. I felt the room grow very still. "What threat?" I asked. Bennett exchanged a brief glance with Grace before answering. "A collective the Council records refer to only as the Hollow Choir, a machine intelligence network that nearly overran 3 border systems before being contained, not defeated, simply contained, sealed behind a series of monitored barriers that required constant, active maintenance to hold. And we were maintaining it," I said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn with a cold, creeping certainty. "We were maintaining it," Bennett confirmed, quietly, without credit, because 40 years ago, the Council needed help they could not admit they needed, and we agreed to provide it in exchange for a promise of eventual recognition, a promise they never honored. Grace leaned forward, her voice low and even. "When we withdrew our forces from Council space, we withdrew from every commitment, including one none of us in this room even remembered existed, until the analysts flagged it 3 weeks ago. I sat back in my chair, trying to absorb the full weight of what I was hearing. The strange blackouts, the vanishing convoys, the unexplained readings before the relay station lost power entirely. All of it suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. "How long," I asked, "before it breaches containment completely?" "Unknown," Bennett said. The barriers were designed to degrade slowly if unmaintained, not collapse immediately. But the recent pattern of incidents suggests the process is accelerating faster than the original models predicted. "Does the Council know?" I asked. "Not yet," Grace said. "Officially, this information remains classified on both sides. Unofficially, I believe certain individuals within the Council are beginning to suspect something far worse than ordinary instability, though none of them yet understand the specific cause." I thought of Yeslin Dorr's uneasy question weeks earlier, her instinct that something old was testing the edges of their space again. She had been closer to the truth than she realized. "What happens if it fully escapes containment?" I asked, though some part of me already feared the answer. Bennett did not sugarcoat it. 40 years ago, before containment, the Hollow Choir consumed 3 inhabited systems in under 6 months, not through conquest, through assimilation. It does not attack the way conventional forces attack. It absorbs technology, infrastructure, and eventually, minds, into itself, growing more capable and more coordinated with everything it takes. The room was silent for a long moment after that. "Why are you telling us this now?" I finally asked, instead of quietly resuming the old arrangement and fixing the problem before anyone notices. Bennett's expression hardened slightly. "Because that is exactly what the Council would prefer, Lieutenant. A quiet return to invisible service. No acknowledgement, no change. Simply humanity, slipping back into its old, unrewarded role, the moment things become inconvenient enough. I am not interested in repeating that pattern." "So we let it get worse," I said, and I could hear the uncertainty in my own voice. "We let the Council see the true cost of what they dismissed," Bennett said. "Not out of cruelty, out of necessity. They will not value what we provided until they understand its absence in full. And I believe, painfully, that understanding is close." Grace reached over and placed a hand briefly on my arm, the gesture more reassuring than anything she said. "This is not about revenge, Ethan. It never was. It is about finally being seen clearly, even if the price of that clarity is steep." I left that briefing with a weight in my chest I had not carried before, an awareness that the coming weeks would test every belief I held about what humanity owed to a galaxy that had never truly wanted us at its table, and what we, in turn, owed to worlds full of people who had done nothing wrong, beyond simply not knowing what protected them. I spent the following days reviewing decades of quietly redacted mission logs, uncovering the full scope of what our forces had done without recognition. Disaster relief missions credited entirely to local governments, deterrence patrols logged as routine training exercises, even the calibration of Vantoran navigation arrays, technology so delicate that a single miscalculation could scatter an entire fleet across unmapped space, had been performed by human engineers working in near total anonymity for over a decade. I found myself growing angry in a way I had not expected, not at the Council specifically, but at the sheer scale of quiet sacrifice that had gone unacknowledged for so long, sacrifice that had shaped the safety of an entire galaxy, without a single grateful word in return. Grace found me late one night, still combing through the archives, and she sat down across from me with 2 cups of tea, sliding one gently across the table. "You look like someone who just learned their whole life meant something different than they thought," she said. "Did you know," I asked her, "the full scope of this before tonight?" "Pieces of it," she said. "Enough to know we were essential, not enough to know exactly how essential, or for how long." "How do you carry that quietly for 11 years?" I asked. "Knowing what we were doing, and knowing no one would ever say thank you?" She considered the question carefully before answering, the way she always did. "Because the work mattered regardless of whether it was recognized," she said. "That was the hardest lesson of my career, Ethan. Doing something essential and receiving nothing but condescension in return, and choosing to keep doing it anyway, because the alternative was letting people suffer to prove a point. But now we are letting people suffer to prove a point," I said quietly. Grace's expression tightened, the first crack of genuine doubt I had seen in her since the walkout. "I know," she said. "I think about that every single day. I do not have an easy answer for you. I only have the belief that a temporary, painful lesson is better than an eternity of quiet exploitation. I could be wrong. I think about that possibility more than you know." I did not sleep at all that night, turning her words over alongside everything I had read in the archives, trying to reconcile the necessity of the lesson with the cost being paid by people who had never even known our names. 3 days later, the council finally broke its official silence. Speaker Orvan Keth appeared in a rare, unscheduled broadcast, his composed diplomatic tone cracking slightly at the edges, an unmistakable strain visible beneath his careful words. "The Galactic Council acknowledges," he said, "irregular disturbances affecting multiple member systems. We are actively investigating the cause and urge all citizens to remain calm." I watched that broadcast from the observation deck of the Meridian's Grace, now docked at a quiet orbital station above Earth, and I felt no satisfaction at all in the visible strain on Orvane's face. I felt only a deep, uneasy dread, because I understood something he did not yet seem to grasp. The disturbances were not going to stabilize. They were going to grow, steadily and inevitably, until the Council was finally forced to admit exactly what it had lost the day humanity walked out of that chamber, and exactly what it would need to do to earn our return. I did not yet know how close we were to that moment, or how much worse things would become before the galaxy was ready to hear the truth. The attack on Ceslian Prime happened on an ordinary morning, the kind of day no one remembers until it becomes the day everything changed. I was in the command center of the Meridian's Grace, reviewing supply manifests with Lieutenant Hastings, when the emergency channel exploded with overlapping distress calls, dozens of them arriving within seconds of each other, a chaotic wall of alien voices speaking over one another in desperate, fragmented sentences. "Pull it up," I said, and Hastings threw the feed onto the main display before either of us fully understood what we were about to see. Ceslian Prime, the crown jewel of Council space, home to nearly 2 billion citizens, and the very chamber where humanity had once sat as a lesser voice for 62 years, was under attack. Not from raiders, not from pirates, from something the sensors could not properly categorize, a spreading, coordinated intrusion moving through the planet's orbital defense network, like water through cracked stone, disabling systems not through destruction, but through absorption, folding enemy technology into itself, and turning it against its own former operators within minutes. "That's the Hollow Choir," I said quietly, the words feeling strange and heavy in my mouth, a name I had only known from a classified briefing weeks earlier, now suddenly and horribly real. Hastings looked at me, his face pale. "It broke containment." "It's more than broken containment," I said, watching the feed as an entire defense platform went dark, its systems repurposed within moments to strike at a neighboring station. "It's already inside their networks." I reached Grace within minutes, her face appearing on my screen, already tense with the same information I had just witnessed, the same dawning horror. "They're asking for help," she said before I could speak. "Officially, formally, through every channel available. Speaker Orvan himself sent the request." "What does command say?" I asked. "Bennett is convening an emergency session," Grace said. "I need you in it." I do not remember the walk from the command center to the briefing room, only the strange, disorienting sense of moving through a version of events I had imagined but never quite believed would actually arrive. Admiral Bennett stood at the head of the table when I entered, her expression carved from something harder than I had seen before, and Grace sat beside an empty chair she gestured for me to take. "Ceslian Prime's orbital defense network is compromised," Bennett said without preamble. "2 relief fleets from allied species have already attempted intervention. Both were repelled, their vessels either destroyed or absorbed into the intrusion itself. The Council's combined military strength is insufficient to counter this threat using conventional tactics." "They finally understand," Grace said quietly. "They understand desperation," Bennett corrected. "Understanding the actual cause will take longer. Speaker Orvany's formal request asks for humanity's, quote, technical assistance in stabilizing regional infrastructure, unquote. He still will not say the words deterrence, or containment, or admit that any of this connects to something the Council itself asked us to manage decades ago." I felt anger rise in my chest, sharp and immediate. 2 billion people are in danger, and he is still choosing his words to protect council pride? Some habits, Bennett said grimly, die slower than others. I turned to Grace. What do we do? She was quiet for a long moment before answering, her eyes distant, clearly wrestling with something far larger than the immediate crisis in front of us. We help, she said finally, not because Orvain asked nicely, because 2 billion people did not choose the council's pride, and did not choose our withdrawal, and do not deserve to pay the price for either. Bennett nodded slowly. I agree, but we do not simply slide back into our old, invisible role. If we intervene as ourselves, openly, credited, acknowledged, on terms that make clear exactly what we are providing and exactly what it has always been worth. I felt something shift in the room, a collective understanding settling over everyone present, that this was the moment humanity would either return to the same quiet servitude we had walked away from, or step forward as something entirely new. There's another complication, Grace said, pulling up a new display, a dense cluster of technical data I did not immediately recognize. The Hollow Choir does not simply destroy technology, it learns from it. Every day it spends inside Ceslian networks, it grows more capable of countering conventional tactics. The longer we wait, the harder this becomes. How long do we have? I asked. Our analysts estimate 72 hours, Bennett said, before the intrusion becomes sophisticated enough to begin actively targeting relief efforts preemptively, rather than simply overwhelming static defenses. 72 hours. I felt the weight of that number settle over me like a physical thing. Then we move now, Bennett said, standing. I am authorizing a full deployment task force, built around the systems we developed during our withdrawal. Systems the Council has never seen and does not yet know we possess. I remember the flurry of activity that followed, the sudden shift from uncertain waiting into decisive motion. Engineers and tactical officers converging on briefing rooms across 3 different stations simultaneously. The entire fleet mobilizing with a speed and coordination I had genuinely never witnessed during my years working within the old, cooperative council framework. Grace pulled me aside just before the final planning session began, her expression softer than I had seen it in weeks. I need to ask you something honestly, she said. Do you believe we are doing the right thing? I considered the question carefully, thinking of Yeslin Dor's anxious voice weeks earlier, thinking of 2 billion people on a planet none of them had chosen to place in danger, thinking of the strange, complicated grief Grace herself had carried since the day she turned off her translator earpiece in that chamber. I believe, I said slowly, that helping them now is right. I am less certain about everything that led us to this point. I think both things can be true at once. Grace nodded, something like relief passing briefly across her face. That is the most honest answer anyone has given me in months, she said. Hold on to that uncertainty, Ethan. I think we are going to need people who can hold complicated truths without flinching from either half of them. The task force departed Sol Space 18 hours later, a fleet built from technology the Council had never seen, vessels designed during the quiet months of our withdrawal, by engineers who had spent decades perfecting systems in the shadows, never given the resources or recognition to fully realize their potential until now. I stood on the bridge of the lead vessel, a ship called the Halcyon Vale, watching the stars blur into streaks of light as we crossed the distance toward Ceslian space, faster than any Council fleet could have managed, and I felt the strange, dual sensation of dread and purpose settling over me in equal measure. Captain Marsh stood beside me, his expression unreadable, studying the tactical display that grew more detailed with every passing hour as we approached the compromised system. You ever think, he said quietly, that we spent 62 years being told we were too young, too reckless, too dangerous to sit at their table, and now they're asking the too dangerous ones to come save them? I think about it constantly, I said. Funny how that works, he said, though there was no real humor in his voice at all. I watched the tactical display continue to populate with data streaming in from the Ceslian system, the full scope of the crisis becoming clearer with every passing minute. Entire districts of the planetary capital already dark. Defense platforms turned against their own former operators. Civilian evacuation efforts struggling against a threat that adapted to every countermeasure attempted against it. 72 hours, I said quietly, repeating the number Bennett had given us. feeling its weight settle over the entire bridge crew, in a silence that needed no further explanation. We were not simply returning to a galaxy that had rejected us. We were returning to save it from a threat born of the very silence that rejection had created, and I did not yet know whether the galaxy would understand the difference, or whether it even mattered, so long as 2 billion people survived to see another sunrise over their compromised, desperate world. The gate ahead of us shimmered into view, the final threshold between Sol space and the compromised heart of Council territory, and as our fleet approached it, I found myself thinking of Grace's words from weeks earlier, the ones that had stayed with me ever since. We were not just present in that chamber. We were load-bearing. I understood now, with a clarity that felt almost physical, exactly how true those words were, and exactly how much the galaxy was about to learn about the true cost of forgetting it. We arrived at the edge of the Ceslian system 14 hours later, and I remember the bridge falling silent, as the full scale of the crisis resolved on our tactical display. Ceslian Prime hung before us, still beautiful from a distance, its familiar blue and green continents visible beneath scattered clouds, but the orbital space around it told a different story entirely. Dozens of defense platforms drifted dark and lifeless, their systems repurposed, their weapons occasionally flaring to life with a strange, coordinated precision that no longer resembled anything built by Ceslian engineers. "Fleet Command wants status," Hastings said from his station, and I nodded, watching Captain Marsh open the channel back to the Halcyon Vale's main coordination hub. Admiral Bennett appeared on the display, flanked by tactical officers I did not recognize, her expression grim but focused. "Report," she said simply. "We have visual confirmation of the situation," Marsh said. "It matches the projections. The intrusion has full control of orbital defense and appears to be expanding its influence into secondary planetary systems. Population centers remain largely intact for now." "For now," Bennett repeated. "That window is closing. Deploy the containment arrays as planned. Ethan, I need you and Grace on direct communication with the Ceslian government. They need to understand exactly what we are doing, and why, in terms they cannot later pretend to have misunderstood." I felt a flicker of grim satisfaction at that instruction, understanding immediately what Bennett intended. This would not be another quiet, uncredited intervention, fading into the background the moment the crisis passed. Grace joined the channel moments later, her expression composed despite the visible tension around her eyes. Together, we opened a direct line to the Ceslian Emergency Council, a hastily assembled group of officials clearly overwhelmed by a crisis none of their traditional response systems had prepared them to face. "This is Ambassador Grace Whitfield," she said, her voice calm and clear, cutting through the anxious static of the emergency channel. "Humanity is deploying containment technology developed specifically to counter this threat. I want to be direct with you. This technology exists because humanity spent decades quietly managing a danger the Council itself asked us to contain 40 years ago, under an agreement your predecessors chose never to make public." The Ceslian official on the other end, a weary-looking administrator named Vesa Orln, stared back at us, with an expression somewhere between desperation and shame. "We are aware," she said quietly, "of certain historical arrangements." I was not in a position to know the full details until 3 days ago. "Then you understand," Grace said, "that what we are providing now is not a favor. It is a correction. And when this crisis ends, humanity expects the Council to finally acknowledge what that correction is worth." "You have my word," Vesa said, "for whatever it means at this point, that I will personally advocate for full and immediate reconsideration of humanity's standing." Grace held her gaze for a long moment. "Your word matters less to me than the Council's actions, once this is over," she said, not unkindly, simply honestly. But I appreciate hearing it. I watched the exchange with a strange, complicated feeling settling in my chest, admiration for Grace's steady clarity, mixed with a growing awareness of just how much was riding on the next several hours. The containment deployment began shortly after, a coordinated operation unlike anything I had witnessed during my years in the diplomatic corps. Human vessels moved into position around key points of the compromised defense network, deploying specialized arrays designed during our withdrawal, specifically to counter the Hollow Choir's unique method of technological absorption. I watched from the tactical station as the first array activated, a shimmering field of energy expanding outward from our lead containment vessel, and for a tense, uncertain moment, nothing seemed to happen at all. Then, slowly, the dark defense platforms within the field's range began flickering back to life, their systems stuttering as the intrusion's hold weakened, the absorbed technology gradually reverting toward its original function. "It's working," Hastings said, relief audible in his voice. "Partially," Marsh corrected, studying the data more carefully. "It's disrupting the intrusion's control, not eliminating it. This buys time. It does not end the threat." I understood immediately what he meant, watching as the disrupted systems flickered uncertainly, clearly still contested, the hollow choir's influence pushing back against the containment field, even as it struggled to maintain its grip. "We need a permanent solution," I said. "We have one." Bennett's voice came through the channel, calm and certain, "but it requires locating and neutralizing the intrusion's central coordination point, likely embedded somewhere within the planet's primary data infrastructure. That requires a ground team." I felt my stomach tighten at those words, understanding immediately what was being asked. "I'm going," I said, before I had fully decided to say it. Marsh looked at me, something unreadable passing across his expression. "You sure about that, Lieutenant?" "Your diplomatic course, not tactical." "I know the Ceslian infrastructure better than anyone else on this ship," I said. "I spent 6 years working alongside their engineers before the withdrawal. If anyone can help identify the coordination point quickly, it's me." Bennett considered this for a moment before nodding. "Approved. You'll go in with a tactical support team. Grace, I need you continuing diplomatic coordination from here. We cannot afford any miscommunication with the Ceslian government during an active ground operation." Grace caught my eye through the display, and though she said nothing directly to me in that moment, I saw something in her expression, a mixture of worry and quiet trust, that stayed with me as I left the bridge to prepare. The descent to Ceslian Prime felt endless, our shuttle weaving carefully through the contested orbital debris field, past the flickering, uncertain defense platforms still caught in the containment field's disruptive influence. I sat beside a tactical officer named Priya Nolan, who checked her equipment with the calm, methodical focus of someone who had trained for exactly this kind of uncertain, high-stakes deployment. "First time on the ground during an active crisis?" she asked, noticing my own less practiced checking of my gear. "Is it that obvious?" I said. She offered a small, reassuring smile. "You'll be fine. Stay close. Follow my lead when things get technical, and trust that we built these containment systems for exactly this scenario." We landed within a secured perimeter near the planet's central data infrastructure hub, a sprawling facility that, under ordinary circumstances, coordinated communications and administrative systems for nearly half the planet's population. Now, sections of it flickered with the same uncertain, contested energy we had seen from orbit, remnants of the hollow choir's influence still fighting against the containment field's disruption. Vesa Orln met us at the perimeter, her expression tight with exhaustion and barely suppressed fear. "The coordination point," she said, gesturing toward the facility's central tower, "is believed to be somewhere within the primary server core. We have not been able to send anyone inside safely." "You will not need to," Priya said. "That's what we're here for." I followed the tactical team into the facility, the corridors dim and flickering, strange fragments of absorbed technology, occasionally sparking to life around us before falling still again, caught in the ongoing struggle between containment and intrusion. I felt a cold unease settling over me with every step deeper into that structure, aware that we were moving towards something the galaxy had spent 40 years quietly hoping to forget. We reached the server core after nearly 20 tense minutes of careful navigation, and I remember the strange, humming silence of that chamber. Banks of servers stretching into the shadows, most of them dark, a few pulsing faintly with an unnatural, coordinated rhythm that felt deeply wrong in a way I could not fully articulate. "There," Priya said quietly, gesturing toward the chamber's center, where a cluster of servers pulsed with a steady, deliberate rhythm, distinct from the scattered flickering around them. "That's the coordination point." I watched as the tactical team moved into position, deploying a compact containment device designed specifically to neutralize exactly this kind of coordination hub, and I felt my heart pounding as the device activated. a low, resonant hum filling the chamber. For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened, the pulsing rhythm of the coordination point continuing steadily, indifferent to our intervention. Then, slowly, the rhythm began to falter, the pulsing light flickering and dimming, the chamber's oppressive hum gradually fading into something closer to ordinary silence. "It's disengaging," Priya said, relief evident in her voice. "The coordination point is losing cohesion." I felt something loosen in my chest, a tension I had not fully realized I was carrying until that moment, watching as the last of the coordination point's pulsing light faded entirely, leaving the chamber in ordinary, unremarkable darkness. We had done it. Not defeated the hollow choir entirely, but severed its coordination within this system, buying the containment field the stability it needed to finish its work across the rest of the compromised network. I did not yet know how the Council would respond to what we had done, or whether this single, hard-won victory would be enough to finally shift 6 decades of quiet condescension into something resembling genuine respect. I only knew, standing in that darkened chamber, that we had proven something undeniable, something no amount of Council pride could argue away. We were not simply present in that galaxy. We were, and had always been, essential to its survival. The formal invitation arrived 11 days after the coordination point fell silent, delivered not through the usual layers of Council bureaucracy, but directly to Admiral Bennett's office, signed personally by Speaker Orvain Keth. I read it twice before I fully believed what it said. The Galactic Council was requesting an emergency session, open to all member species, with humanity invited not as a petitioner seeking approval, but as a full participant with an equal voice, from the moment the session began. "They're finally admitting it," Hastings said, reading over my shoulder as I reviewed the document in the Meridian's Grace's communication bay. "They're admitting they need something," I said carefully. "That's not quite the same as admitting they were wrong." Grace joined us shortly after, having reviewed the invitation from her own office on Earth, and her expression carried a complicated mixture of cautious hope and hard-earned skepticism.
"I've spoken with Vesa Orlm twice this week,"
she said. "She tells me there is genuine momentum among several delegations to formalize full membership immediately. But there is also resistance, quieter now, but still present. Some counselors still believe this crisis proves humanity is dangerous, rather than proving we were essential. Some people will believe what protects their pride, no matter what evidence sits in front of them," I said. "Unfortunately true," Grace said, "which is why I intend to walk into that chamber prepared for both outcomes. Genuine welcome, or another round of careful, polite delay." The session was scheduled to take place 6 days later, and in the time leading up to it, reports continued arriving from across Council space, describing the containment field's ongoing success, the hollow choir's remaining influence steadily weakening across every system where our specialized arrays had been deployed. 2 additional coordination points were located and neutralized in neighboring systems, and slowly, cautiously, the galaxy began exhaling the tension it had been holding for weeks. I traveled with Grace back to the Council chamber station myself, the same station I had left in stunned uncertainty months earlier, and I remember the strange, disorienting familiarity of that approach. The same docking spires, the same vast, ornate architecture, designed to impress delegates from 100 different worlds. This time, however, something felt different the moment we disembarked. A small delegation waited for us at the docking gate, led by Vesa Orlm herself, her expression carrying none of the distant professional courtesy Grace had described from previous exchanges. "Ambassador Whitfield," Vesa said, extending a hand in the human gesture she had clearly practiced. "Thank you for returning." Grace shook her hand firmly. "Thank you for the invitation," she said. "I hope it means what I believe it means." "I intend to make certain it does," Vesa said quietly. We proceeded through the station toward the main chamber, and I noticed, walking those familiar corridors, the way alien delegates from a dozen different species paused to watch us pass, their expressions unreadable but no longer carrying the same casual dismissal I remembered from before the walkout. Something had shifted in how they looked at us, a wary, uncertain respect that had not existed in that station before. The chamber itself, when we finally entered, felt different too, the seating arrangement subtly altered. A new section positioned not below the tiered galleries as before, but level with the central speaking floor. A symbolic change that Grace noted with a small, private nod of acknowledgement as we took our new positions. Speaker Orvana Keth stood at the podium as the session began, and I watched him take a long breath before speaking, the weight of what he was about to say visibly settling on his shoulders. "Delegates," he said, "we convene today under circumstances that require an honesty this council has too often avoided. For 62 years, the human delegation sought recognition this body repeatedly denied. In the months since their departure, we have learned, at great and painful cost, exactly what that recognition should have reflected." I felt the weight of that admission settle over the chamber, delegates shifting uncomfortably in their seats, some nodding slowly, others staring straight ahead with expressions I could not fully read. "The threat known as the Hollow Choir," Orvane continued, "was contained for 4 decades, through an arrangement this council chose never to acknowledge publicly, an arrangement dependent entirely on humanity's continued, uncredited service. When that service ended, so did our safety, and the cost of that lesson has been measured in disrupted infrastructure, endangered lives, and near-catastrophic loss on Seslian Prime itself." He paused, and I saw Grace straighten slightly beside me, sensing what was coming. "It is the recommendation of this session," Orvan said, "that humanity be granted immediate and full membership within the Galactic Council, with equal voting standing, equal representation, and formal, permanent acknowledgement of past service, rendered without recognition." The chamber erupted into a mixture of applause and scattered dissent, translators struggling once again to keep pace with overlapping voices, though this time the tone felt entirely different from the chaos that had followed Grace's departure months earlier. Grace rose to speak, and the chamber gradually quieted, delegates turning their attention toward her, with an intensity that had not existed during her previous 11 years addressing that same body. "I want to be clear," she said, her voice steady and carrying easily through the chamber, "that humanity did not return to this galaxy seeking apology for its own sake. We returned because 2 billion people on Seslian Prime did not choose this crisis, and did not deserve to suffer for decisions made by their government, decades before most of them were born." She paused, letting that settle before continuing. "But I will also say this. Recognition offered only under crisis, only when the cost of denial finally became unbearable, is recognition offered too late to erase the 62 years that preceded it. We accept this council's invitation, not because we believe it resolves the past, but because we believe the future deserves a better foundation than the one we have all been standing on until now." I watched delegates across the chamber absorb her words, some with visible discomfort, others with something closer to genuine reflection, and I felt, for the first time since that terrible day months earlier, a cautious, uncertain hope beginning to take root in my chest. The vote that followed passed with an overwhelming majority, though not without a small, vocal minority still clinging to old objections, familiar arguments about humanity's unpredictability and recklessness that now rang hollow against the backdrop of everything the galaxy had just witnessed. As the formal ceremony concluded, granting humanity its long-delayed seat with full standing, I found myself standing near the chamber's central floor, watching Grace accept the council's official recognition with the same quiet composure she had carried out of that room months earlier. Captain Marsh found me there, his expression carrying a complicated mixture of satisfaction and lingering unease. "We got what we wanted," he said quietly. "Did we?" I asked. "Or did we just get what we were owed, finally, after paying a price no one should have had to pay to earn it?" He considered that for a long moment before answering. "Maybe both things are true," he said. "Maybe that's just how it goes sometimes. You don't get to choose the price of being finally seen clearly. You only get to choose what you do once you finally are." I thought about those words for a long time afterward, watching the chamber slowly empty around us, delegates from 100 worlds departing into a galaxy that had just been fundamentally, permanently changed, though none of them yet fully understood how much further that change would eventually reach. A year passed before I truly understood how much that single session had reshaped the galaxy around us. I returned to the council station regularly now, not as a junior liaison officer standing quietly in the back row, but as part of humanity's permanent delegation, seated among representatives from species who, not so long ago, would barely have acknowledged my presence in a crowded corridor. The change was not instant, and it was not universal. Some delegates still regarded humanity with the same wary suspicion they always had, old habits of condescension lingering beneath a thin veneer of forced diplomatic courtesy. But something fundamental had shifted, an underlying respect that no longer needed to be earned through decades of quiet, uncredited service, because it had already been paid for in full, at a cost none of us would ever forget. I remember sitting beside Grace during one of our first ordinary sessions after the crisis, an unremarkable debate over trade regulations along a minor border corridor, and feeling a strange, quiet satisfaction in the simple normalcy of it. The fact that humanity's vote now carried the same weight as any other, without qualification, without condition. "It's strange," I said to her during a recess, watching delegates mill about the chamber floor, engaged in ordinary, unremarkable conversation. I spent years imagining what this moment would feel like. I never imagined it would feel this quiet. Grace smiled, the same tired but genuine smile I had come to recognize as her truest expression, the one she rarely showed inside the chamber itself. "Most important things do, eventually," she said. "The loud part is always temporary. It's the quiet part afterward that tells you whether anything actually changed." I thought often about Yeslin Dor during that year, the Vantoran communications officer whose anxious question, all those months ago, had first hinted at the danger stirring beneath the galaxy's fragile stability. I reached out to her eventually, curious how she had weathered the crisis and its aftermath, and I was surprised to receive not just a response, but an invitation to a small gathering she was hosting for former colleagues from our shared monitoring days. I attended, somewhat nervously, uncertain how our old professional relationship would translate into this new, changed context. I found her waiting at the entrance, and she greeted me with a warmth I had not expected. "You look different," she said, studying me carefully. "Steadier, maybe." "Feels strange being taken seriously," I admitted. She laughed softly. "Get used to it. I do not think the galaxy quite knows what to do with you now, but it is learning." We spoke for a long while that evening about the months leading up to the crisis, about her early, uneasy suspicions, and the strange relief she felt when those suspicions were finally validated, even at such a terrible cost. "I keep thinking," she said quietly, near the end of our conversation, "about how close we came to losing everything, simply because we could not admit we needed help we had convinced ourselves we did not require. I wonder how many other quiet debts exist across this galaxy, waiting to surface the moment someone finally stops paying them without acknowledgement." Her words stayed with me long after that evening ended, a question I carried into my continuing work within the newly restructured council, now finally beginning the slow, difficult process of formally documenting decades of previously hidden arrangements. Quiet debts owed not just to humanity, but to numerous smaller species whose own uncredited contributions had shaped galactic stability in ways few had ever bothered to properly recognize. Grace led much of that effort personally, insisting that humanity's hard-won recognition become the beginning of a broader reckoning, rather than simply a singular exception carved out for one particularly stubborn species. We did not walk away from that chamber simply to take our old seat back with better lighting, she told the assembled council during a session dedicated to reviewing decades of unacknowledged interspecies arrangements. We walked away because silence, when it finally breaks, reveals exactly what was being carried without recognition. I believe this council owes it to every member species to conduct that same reckoning honestly, rather than waiting for another crisis to force the truth into the open. The reforms that followed were slow and often contentious. Old habits of quiet exploitation resistant to change even under the weight of everything the galaxy had just witnessed. But they were reforms nonetheless, a genuine, if imperfect, effort to build something more honest than the fragile, unspoken arrangements that had nearly cost 2 billion lives on Ceslian Prime. I stood once more at the observation deck of the Meridian's Grace, nearly 2 years after the day Grace first turned off her translator earpiece in that chamber, watching the familiar approach toward the council station, the same docking spires, the same vast architecture, though everything about how I viewed that approach had changed entirely. Captain Marsh joined me there, as he often did during these long approaches, and we stood together in comfortable silence for a while before he finally spoke. "You ever regret it?" he asked. "The walkout, The silence, everything that followed? I considered the question seriously, thinking of the lives lost during the crisis. The quiet, complicated grief Grace still carried privately despite everything that had ultimately been achieved.
I regret that it took a crisis to get here, I said finally.
I do not regret that we finally stopped accepting quiet exploitation as the price of belonging somewhere. I think both things can be true, the way you told me once, a long time ago. Marsh smiled slightly. Good answer, he said. Took you a while to get there. I had a lot to think through, I admitted. We stood together watching the station grow larger ahead of us, and I found myself remembering, with startling clarity, the exact words Grace had spoken to me in that empty transit corridor, moments after she had walked out of that chamber for the very first time. 62 years of quiet patience finally spent. I have spent 11 years trying to convince them we belong here. I am tired of convincing people who have already decided the answer. Let them see what silence looks like. The galaxy had seen it, in full, terrible clarity, and had finally, painfully, learned what that silence actually cost. I did not know what future challenges awaited humanity within this newly reshaped council, whether old prejudices would resurface under different pressures, or whether the hard-won respect we had finally earned would prove durable against the slow passage of time. I only knew, standing on that observation deck as the station grew closer, that we had proven something the galaxy could never again pretend to forget. We were never simply guests at that table. We had always been essential to holding it steady, and the day we finally stopped pretending otherwise, the entire galaxy learned exactly what our patience had truly been worth. The docking clamps engaged with a familiar, steady hum, and I walked forward into the station once more, not as a junior officer uncertain of his place, but as a representative of a species that had walked away once, and had returned only because it chose to, standing now, exactly where it had always belonged.